So Micah 6, 1 through 8. Hear what the Lord says. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the case of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a case against his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? And what have I wearied you? Answer me, for I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give him my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And I'd like to add Amos to this, because I can't hardly think of Micah without then my brain going straight to Amos. And so God says, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. That's hard news for the church. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody from your harps. But let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So when we look at this, of what we sort of expect to do as if we can earn God's favor, what we actually do in our day-to-day lives that are distracted, because aren't most of us distracted? And aren't most of us exhausted? We are people that do too much. I was telling Jen just a few minutes ago, I seem to have an inability to say the word no. I'm slowly learning how to do it, and it kills me inside when I do it. And in my half-awake state, yes comes out of my mouth before I realize what I have done. And then 2 weeks later, I'm in a sheer panic. Dwight called me at 10 p.m. one night and convinced me that we really needed to be in Denver in March. And he gave a good case, and I was sleepy. And he said, we just need to turn in an abstract and go and present a paper in Denver. And in the heat of the moment, it sounded like a good idea at the time. So I said, when is it due? And he said, at midnight. Okay, by now it's 10:30, 10:45, and we got it in on time because I can't say no. The problem is now I've got to go to Denver. Somebody at St. Louis called me and said, hey, we'd love for you to give a talk on February 4th. What did I say? Of course I will. We are overburdened with responsibilities, usually from our own. Of course I'll do that. Because don't we all do that? We say yes because we're supposed to. So we're distracted and we're overburdened. And because we're tired and distracted, we're easily triggered. We need rest. We need community. And the problem of when we're overburdened and overstressed and all the rest is we tend to then not want to go out and be in communion with one another, drawing fellowship with one another. Because there is something special about an ability to be with people you know, people who you care for and you know that they care for you, to be able to hug, to be able to hear and recognize when somebody is in grief or suffering. And so I think about the two meanings of the church. And a lot of this I'm stealing straight from John Dorhauer, the president of the UCC. He's going to be president for a few more months. But he talks about there are two words that we use to mean the church. And one of them is Latin, and one of them is Greek. And the Latin word is congregation, and that's the one we tend to use. In a congregation, we congregate, we come together, we are with one another. And I think that as we saw with COVID, we suffer when we're not together, when we're not with one another. You know, we need to be in fellowship together, to draw sustenance from one another, to see one another's pain and to recognize one another's joys. It's vitally important for us to congregate. And too often we don't. Why? Because we're distracted and overwhelmed and overburdened and we can't say no and all. There are a million reasons why we don't come together. But boy, we need to. We need one another. And so congregating is a vital aspect of the church. And it's one that we're letting go of more and more. It's hard to get up on a cold Sunday morning. I'm not a morning person. It's hard for me to get up for any reason early in the day. That's just not who I am. It's a lot easier for me to sleep in. I would love church to be at 1 o'clock. Let's have lunch together. Fellowship together. Gets in the way of football for a lot of folks. But we've got to come together. We suffer when we don't. One of the things about depression, because that's what poor of spirit is. Poor of spirit are those people that are suffering mentally and spiritually. Think about how many of us are poor in spirit, facing such hardship, and so often feeling alone. You know, even when everybody else is feeling the same way, sometimes it still feels like I'm the only one who understands the burden I'm carrying. But when we come together and hear those pains, we recognize we're all bound together. Congregating is vital, especially for us, you know, who at one time or another are poor in spirit. But there's this other side of the church, and that's ecclesia. And ecclesia is a going out. So congregations come in together, and they nurture one another, and they support one another. And they do that so that they can in turn then go out. Go out and share the good news. And for me, I think it's also go out and be the good news. And at times, congregations do that. I mean, we don't have to go far to put the food in the food pantry. It's right here with us. Con is with. The food pantry's with us. And so we're doing an example of the good news without having to go very far. But there are other ways in which we need to go out. And we need to be what Jesus is calling us to be. Because if we, as we see with Micah and if we see with Amos, if all we do is congregate, we end up preaching to the choir. We can have the most amazing choir, but if nobody hears it, then how does that good news get out? You can go on the search committee and find Billy Graham himself. But if you're only here in this building, who's going to hear it? We can be as loving and welcoming as any person or group, but if the people outside don't know it, they're not going to come. How do we be the church in not just the congregation, which is vitally important, but how do we be the church as ecclesia? Taking the strength and the love and the compassion and the service and all of those things that I know we are. How do we take that into the world? And this gets back to, 3 weeks ago now, the conversation I had with the confirmands. The good news is not just Jesus died and was resurrected and there's this salvific quality to that. That's vitally important. But if we just go out and pounce people with that message, we'll probably scare them off. But if they see us as the church, if they see us going out into the world, and because of our faith, and because of our salvation, that we are being the people that Jesus called us to be, now that's something that might pique their interest. That's something that might have them say, I wonder what's going on over there in Ebenezer. You got to have both sides. We have to come together because the world's a hard place and we cannot stand alone. On the everyday mess, we've got 3 kids back here. Well, 3 little kids. I think that we've got grown ones too. Thank goodness. But it's hard. It's hard, if not impossible, to raise a child in isolation. Somebody's got to take a turn at helping mom sleep. Somebody's got to, we've got to work together for this so important task of raising our kids. In the simple things and the complex things, we've got to come together. But we've also got to go out. And we've got to find a way to do that. We need one another to support and care for one another. We need the congregation as a touchstone in this world that pulls us a million different directions. I was reading an old book, and I don't know the date, and it's escaping me right now, but John Dewey's A Common Faith. And Dewey, he was dead in the early 50s, so this is late 30s, early 40s. He said, we live in a world where the things that the church used to do when the church went out into the world, we now have other organizations doing it. And thank goodness that these other organizations exist because, there's a whole lot of need in this world. But because the Red Cross is doing this, or because, whatever group is doing this ecclesia, this going out, the church has become more and more comfortable with just being congregations. So when young people look at us, what do young people want? I think a lot of times they want what Micah and Amos are talking about. They're wanting what Jesus is talking about. We want to see a congregation that hears our pains, that demands justice, and will fight for justice. We want congregations who are also ecclesia. We need to go out, and this is hard because we're overburdened and distracted and triggered. We're people who are meant to go out and to live God's call as individuals, as congregations, as citizens. If we don't go out and work for justice and peace, to bring hope and consolation, we're not truly being the church. There's a sign that the UCC puts out, and I think there's one that was in the hanging in the hall. It says, "Be the church." And it's covered with words and phrases of what that means. And it fits these three readings. Everything on that sign is an element of the Beatitudes or this seeking after justice. It helps us see what we're meant to be. So now, do we hold ourselves to the standards that Jesus gives us in Matthew and that Micah and Amos give us? Are we peacemakers, or do we stir the pot? Because it's easy to stir the pot at family gatherings. It's easy to stir the pot at community events. Do we bang the gongs of war, or do we follow the Prince of Peace? Are we meek and curious? Because this world's an amazing place, and there are all sorts of communities in it. Or are we so convinced of our own position that we have stopped listening to others, especially those who are crying out for justice? I know that a lot of us assume what the people on the margins are like and how they got there. I mean, don't we all have stories of how the people on the corner of St. Louis or Washington or wherever that are asking for money, they're probably drug addicts. Isn't that the phrase? That's probably a scam. But I'm thinking about the number of soldiers that I encountered at the hospital, many of them sent over by the VA, who were unhoused. That they came back from war and they didn't have the resources they needed, and they turned alcohol and drugs as self-medication. And then they ended up on the streets. So yeah, a lot of those veterans were alcoholics and drug addicts. But boy, there's a story how they got there. There's a brokenness that needed to be healed that wasn't. We easily dismiss and ignore the folks on the margins. How often do we ignore or downplay the pain of those who mourn? It's time to get over it. Move on with your life. Don't we hear that? And goodness, how often have we said it? People don't mourn on a timetable. How often do we look at people who are poor in spirit? They just need to snap out of it. What do they have to be depressed about? Jesus gives us something else. Blessed are those people. And blessed are us when we are those people, because at one point we are those things that Jesus talks about. As a church, we are called to congregate, to love one another, to care for one another, and to take the strength that comes from that congregating, that love that we find here, that acceptance that we find here, and take it into the world. And that means we start here. Because again, talk to anybody who doesn't go to church, and we know what they say about us. How do we prove them wrong? How do we love one another so deeply and so completely and so authentically that nobody here feels judged? And I'm not talking about just Ebenezer, I'm talking about the church. How does that strengthen our faith? Brighten our light so that light shines out. But the stained glass here is beautiful at night when, for one reason or other, either we're leaving the lights on so the artist can do a nocturne, or one of us forgets to turn the lights off. It's actually so incredibly beautiful. Right? I mean, haven't we all looked at that glass at night? At Christmas, it's breathtaking. But the light only goes so far. How far down the street do we get before we can't see that light, as beautiful as it is? We got to go out and take that love in a way that is received as loving. Because a lot of times, most of the time, love the sinner, hate the sin, isn't received as loving. Whatever that sin might be. So I ask you to look at these Beatitudes and meditate on them. Am I being what Jesus is calling us to be? Am I offering that? Because that's what the church does. We are the ones that are the stand-in for Jesus here on this earth. How do we love as Jesus loved? We got to work on that. Because it is so easy to get distracted and irritated. Almost every family fight starts because somebody's either too tired or too hungry to be as loving as they need to be. Right? How do we meditate on the Beatitudes? And look, I see some laughing because it's true. Yeah, you're hungry right now. Okay, be careful. How do we live into these things? So we're not just a beautiful song that God hears as a clanging noise. How do we be that song that God looks at and says, yes, this is what I meant? It's love. It's compassion. It's care. It's service. It's a call for justice. And we can't be all things to all people, goodness knows. But when I look at this room, every one of you has something that you care deeply about. How do you answer that call? Not all of them. Because I think that's what God is calling us to be. I pray as we go through this week that you'll use this time and one another as a touchstone. That you turn to one another. That we all turn to one another. And that you turn to the Beatitudes. Am I living into this? And when I am the one who is poor in spirit, can I think of somebody at the church that I can turn to and say, boy, today's not a good day? Knowing that in love, that person will be able to hear you and care for you. Because that's what the church is. It's a coming together and a going out. May we do that.